Tonight Ed's going to talk more to us about his practice. I'm focused on 3 projects, in particular Control Order House, which is on show at the University of Brighton. So Ed, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Lighthouse for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. Yes, the idea is that I'm going to talk, if I can fit them all in, about 3 different projects, one of which is very much resolved and finished, one which is kind of taking shape at the moment and is on display at the gallery at the university, and one which is completely unformed and unresolved, and I don't know what to do with it. So I'm going to start by talking about Guantanamo Bay and my book, Guantanamo If the Light Goes Out. Now that is one of the first pictures I took at Guantanamo. This is one of the first things you see when you arrive at the airport on the naval base. Yeah, and I often assume that people know more about Guantanamo than they do. I mean, I've spent 3 years working on this project and I know an awful lot about it. I know the place inside out, but I thought I would start by just saying a few things about Guantanamo and why it's there and who ended up there. As you can see, it's in Cuba. That's kind of a relief sculpture of Cuba. There are probably kind of 2 real reasons why the prison camps are there. The first is to do with the legal situation of the naval base. I mean, the naval base has been there for over 100 years. When America was fighting the Spanish at the end of the 19th century and they defeated the Spanish and they gave Cuba its independence, one of the parts of that deal was that America would be allowed to keep a naval base at Guantanamo at the end of the Cuban mainland. What that means in terms of the legal situation is that because it's on Cuba, Cuban law is sovereign. But as it's an American military base, American military law can be enforced on the base itself. So the idea was that these people who were taken there would not be able to have any protection or any recourse to the American legal system. So they would effectively be held in a sort of legal limbo. The second reason why it's there is that there has been a heritage of confinement at Guantanamo Bay. During the 80s and the 90s, there were various refugee crises there. And at one point, they had a camp with up to, I think it was about 45,000 people held there. So the very first wire cages we saw, the Camp X-ray cages, were left over from the refugee camps that were there. So those are kind of 2 reasons why these people ended up in Guantanamo. As to who was taken there and why they were taken there, we were told, I mean, the message was that these were the worst of the worst picked up on the battlefields of Afghanistan. And, you know, undoubtedly there have been people who were part of Al-Qaeda and members of the Taliban who have been at Guantanamo. But the people we kind of think of as the high-value detainees, people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they didn't arrive until several years after the place had opened. And in fact, a lot of the people who were at Guantanamo were not picked up on the battlefields. A lot of them were picked up in Pakistan. And a lot of people were there because the American military were paying bounty money. They were paying about $5,000 a head for anyone that village elders, Pakistani Secret Service, border guards thought was suspicious, stood out. So in terms of quite a lot of the European detainees that were there. Certainly a lot of the people I work with in the UK, they were picked up in Pakistan. They had been in Afghanistan, but they had left, but they were kind of picked up and bought for $5,000. So what I'm kind of putting across is the idea that the image we have, the association we have with the representation of Guantanamo Bay, and when you start to research it, the reality of who was there and why they were there is more nuanced than you first think. I first got involved with the idea of doing some work about Guantanamo Bay because of this kind of imagery. Everything that we saw from Guantanamo, and a lot of stuff we still see from Guantanamo, is about dehumanization. The classic kind of orange jumpsuited people when the men first arrived, you know, shackled, hooded, their ears covered, shackled ankles, hands at a window. You're not allowed to see anyone's faces. The only faces you see are from the official artist in the military commissions. Even the military are represented as just this large camouflaged presence. Everything's on both sides, you know, everything speaks about dehumanization and demonization. Yet, I was aware of British detainees that had been there, that had been released without charge, that were innocent, not charged with anything, and were living back in the UK. And I knew the kind of places that they lived. I knew some of the areas that they lived in. And I was interested in exploring ways of bringing out the contrast between their situation post-Guantanamo and this kind of representation. So what I did was I contacted one of the lawyers who had represented a lot of the men while they were there, explained what I wanted to do, showed him some previous work, and he put me in touch with one particular detainee. He thought it was going to be very difficult to do, but over time I started to build a relationship with him, and he introduced me to some other of the ex-detainees. And what I did was explain to them that I wanted to photograph where they lived. I wanted to photograph the ordinariness of their homes, the spaces that they were living in post-Guantanamo. I wanted to, in a sense, you know, rehumanize them through looking at the normality of their spaces and playing on our shared experience of, you know, somewhere that we eat, we sleep, we wash, that we relax. We all have those kind of spaces. We all know that kind of experience. So I started by photographing very ordinary things, photographing bedrooms, photographing sitting rooms. Really, as I say, to kind of accentuate the contrast between those demonized representations and the very kind of ordinariness, the normality of these people's living spaces. But while I was doing that, I realized that these were still, in a sense, places of confinement, even though these people had been released and they were now living back home. You know, the experiences they had been through, the form of control they had lived under, the kind of interrogations they had been through, meant they were very traumatized, they were very damaged people. So while, you know, they could be back in these sorts of spaces, they were still reliving, they were still living with the experiences they had been through. And I also realized that there was kind of a two-way memory thing going on here, because, you know, these homes that I was photographing in, for a lot of them, were the kind of spaces they were thinking of while they were in Guantanamo Bay. And vice versa, now that they were back home, they were still dealing with the issues of what happened back in Cuba. And I also couldn't help but be drawn, in a sense, to kind of look for aspects of their living environments, which resonated with me to a certain extent, in some way, with ideas of confinement, ideas of abuse, ideas of trauma. Just details in people's spaces stood out and caught my imagination and caught my eye. This, for example, is something I found in an ex-detainee's house. It belonged to his nephew. It's a rose suspended in some kind of jelly solution, which is slowly decomposing and rising to the surface. So I guess I realized that my original idea of just coming up with this imagery about people's homes was leading on to something else. I'd also researched the naval base. I now knew that it was, you know, it's the largest, I think, military, but certainly naval base outside of America, that had been there for over 100 years, that had grown up since the 1960s and the Cuban Revolution, behind a huge razor wire fence and with a big minefield. So it's, you know, it was small town America that had grown up developed as a place of confinement in its own right. And I also knew that I wanted to kind of explore this idea of the two elements of memory, the two sides of memory, by going and photographing in the prison camps to explore the idea of the spaces, the living spaces of the detainees in the prison camps. I also wanted to engage with the idea of photographing, working with the American military. When you go to Guantanamo, you have to agree to certain things. You have to agree to work with a digital camera. Normally I shoot with film, but you have to agree to shoot digitally so that in the prison camps they can go through all your pictures every day. so that you go through a process of censorship at the end of every day. You're not allowed to photograph things like security cameras. You can't photograph unmanned watchtowers. You can't have more than one watchtower in a picture. You can't have the sky and the sea in the same picture, which is quite an odd one. But, and obviously you can't photograph people's faces either. So I was interested to see how that affected the way I worked. I also, I'd seen a lot of photographs from Guantanamo, which were all, those forms of censorship do kind of steer you towards that kind of dehumanized picture. It kind of pushes you towards taking pictures of people's hands, people's ankles, out of focus detainees. It's kind of, whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know, but it is encouraging you to take a certain type of picture, which feeds into this idea that these people are dehumanized, that they are a threat. So I applied to the Pentagon, that put me onto the media team at Guantanamo Bay, and eventually I was allowed to go for 9 days. You normally get 2 days at Guantanamo, but for various reasons I was able to negotiate to stay longer. And spent half that time photographing in the spaces where the American community live. So this is the type of accommodation that camp personnel live in. So the guards, anyone who works in and around the prison camp stays in this kind of accommodation. And I also photographed on the naval base where the wider American community live, and photographed in the prison camps. This is an exercise cage in Camp 1, which was actually closed when I was there. There have been just under 800 people at Guantanamo Bay, and there are 8 or 9 camps. I mean, there's some camps kind of related to other ones, but 8 or 9 camps which kind of range from the open air cages that we see at Camp X-Ray through to quite sophisticated Supermax style prisons. 7 people, I think, have been convicted of anything while they've been at Guantanamo Bay. So I come back from Guantanamo. I then keep on working. I keep photographing in the homes of ex-detainees. But I kind of expand that from the UK to going to the Middle East and photographing in the homes of detainees in places like Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain. And I decided to kind of limit the homes that I worked in to either Western homes or the homes of detainees in Arab countries where there's a strong Western presence. So rather than going to, I mean, the 2 main kind of populations at Guantanamo have been Yemenis and Afghanis, but I wanted to kind of photograph in homes that people wouldn't necessarily expect to see of people in relation to Guantanamo. And in a sense to kind of look at a deeper theme, which is on the one hand, American foreign policy and going back to one of bin Laden's big problems, which was the presence of America in Saudi Arabia after the First Gulf War. So to look at kind of the presence of the West in those Arab cultures, but also by working in homes in the West, by looking at the presence of Islam in Western homes. So you had this kind of these 2 themes of the West in the Middle East and the perception of the threat of Islam in the West. Anyway, so I end up with these 3 spaces: base, home, and prison camps. I could have done something very obvious and very simple and just presented the work in those 3 contexts. These are the 3 kinds of spaces that you're looking at. But one of the things I had researched was that Guantanamo wasn't just a prison camp. It wasn't just a place of incarceration. It was a place of interrogation. It was kind of almost an ongoing research process for different types of interrogation. And I'd found the Camp Delta standard operating procedures, which was leaked by WikiLeaks, and looked at all sorts of other reports and material. And the process of disorientation and disorganization was central to the experience of Guantanamo. Particularly sensory disorientation, the use of light, people being kept in cells with the light on all the time, or in solitary confinement in the dark, the use of heat, temperature being turned right up or right down. The use of noise, music was used a lot to disorientate people. Lots of tracks being played at the same time, or being held in stress positions with one track played over and over again. Bits of advertising, jingles were played. Barney the dinosaur was played. Various ways in which kind of sensory distortion was used to develop a sense of disorientation and paranoia in the individual, so that they became dependent on their interrogator. They became malleable, they became complicit, they became compliant. So what I decided to do was, in the book, when I present the pictures, I mix all three up together. So you jump from prison camp to naval base to someone's home and back again. And I don't give you any information. You don't know which one you're looking at. You have to work that out for yourself. It's a way of evoking a sense of disorientation, but I also think in terms of photography and in terms of imagery, I think it's more interesting to do that rather than just having a photograph and a caption. You have that kind of immediate, here's a picture, here's a fact, you respond to that and move on to the next one. I actually think it's more interesting to make people form their own kind of visual narrative, their own path, respond to pictures, shape, form, colour. You have to make those connections yourself, meaning, a way of kind of finding your own path. And at the end of the book, you do get the thumbnails, which then tell you, to a certain extent, where you are. That quote at the top is from Binyam Mohammed, who was the last British detainee to be released. And the first time he spoke in public, he kind of referenced this idea of the use of light and the idea of memory and trauma. If the light goes out unexpectedly in a room, I am back in my cell. Which was a very vivid illustration of what I was trying to do with the narrative and the pictures. So I'll take you through some of the images. This is the only picture that's got people in it, and this is just the kind of picture I don't like from Guantanamo. But in the end, I decided to use it as a kind of as a reference point, as a kind of one end of the spectrum of the kind of images I took. And I only used it because I had the two people, the two dehumanized forms together. The detainee on the floor on his prayer mat, and then the reflection of the guard imposed on top of that through the window. This is quite dark. You lost quite a lot of detail at the bottom. This is the open-air cinema on the naval base. So this is, on the naval base, there are all kinds of references of all elements of American society, really, militarism, spirituality, commercialism, all these different kind of elements of American culture, these kind of violent films. Here we are, people sitting watching a film about abuse and torture while it's going on, kind of 2 miles down the road. This is an isolation unit in Camp 1. Camp 1's made out of kind of metal containers. You kind of got 20 cells down each side of a corridor. A shot from someone's home in, I think this was in Kuwait. This is from the house of the camp commander, the guy who's in charge of the whole naval base. It's a little antechamber. An unused communal area in Camp 6, one of the modern Supermax-style prisons. A shrine to the patron saint of Cuba on the naval base. A still life in someone's home. This is the only set-up picture I took. When I say set up, I mean something that's kind of prepared for a media tour. And I used it because this is in the prison camp hospital. It's a very small, there's a ward with about 8 beds and an operating theatre there. And it's a little pyramid of cans of the product used for force feeding with one of the yellow tubes which is used for putting down people's noses, which coming across this in the context of a hospital ward was interesting. fast food on the naval base. This is in Camp 4. This is probably the one picture which kind of sums up Guantanamo and what I was trying to do. It's an arrow pointing to Mecca through a ring for shackling people's ankles. And it goes from the light to the dark. It's got all the elements to it. This is in the Naval Base Museum. It's a model of one of the refugee camps from the 1990s. Shackles in Camp 6. Someone's home in, I can't remember if that's Kuwait or Qatar now, but in the Middle East. This is in the Naval Base supermarket. These are medal ribbons that you can buy, which range from kind of pistol shooting badges through to service with the UN in Bosnia. And the top right, the two red ones there are ribbons you can buy for the global war on terror. This is in Camp 4, which is the only camp where you get shared accommodation. I never actually saw anyone playing this, but it was there. It's a very kind of obvious metaphor for control and confinement, a table football game. And interestingly, all the faces have been scratched off. You can't really see that there, but all the human features have been taken off. The immediate response force equipment in Camp 6. And this is one of the corridors in the airport on the naval base, which has a little exhibition of pictures from the history of Guantanamo Bay. Someone's home. The fellowship room on the naval base. This is next to the church complex. Those are naval knots, each one with a quote from the Bible. And that's Jesus trussed up in the middle up there. The interrogation huts in Camp X-Ray. A detail from a child's cot in the Middle East. From one of the naval base canteens. The empty Islamic cemetery, which was set up by one of the early Muslim chaplains there. The graves at the back are from Marines in the 19th century and Cubans who have lived on the naval base and died there. A detainee's cell in Camp 5. That's Doha in Qatar. Again, from one of the galleys, every American military canteen has one of these tables, it's a still life arrangement. It's a missing in action table where every element has a symbolic significance to do with loss and the family's loss and the colleague's loss, which is all referenced by that text there. If you have a look at the book afterwards, I reproduce that text, it's quite extraordinary when you read it. A duress button in an interrogation cell in Camp 5. That's kind of what the interrogators would hit to call the emergency response force. It's got duress on it. Home, and so on. You kind of jump from space to space. The tiki bar at the officers' mess on the naval base. A mobile force-feeding chair in Camp 6. And the fence line, you're not supposed to photograph this, but it's the fence line separating Cuba from the naval base. Now, I have some audio-visual stuff, some multimedia stuff I've done around this as well, which I think I'll save that if we have time at the end. Probably. Right, okay. I'll just talk about these briefly. This is a very important part of the work. This is called Letters to Omar. Everyone that I worked with, I would ask them if they'd brought anything back from Guantanamo or kept anything and why they'd done that. And this particular detainee, who actually lives in Brighton, said he had some letters which people had sent to him. And in the end, I found he had thousands of these things because there were various campaigns run encouraging people to write letters of support to him while he was there. And these messages, these images, these cards, these letters became transformed, became became complicit in the process of control that was exercised over him. Every element of this guy's life was controlled by his interrogator, including when and if and in what form he got his mail. So everything that was sent to him was scanned, it was censored or redacted, it was stamped, it was given a unique archive number, and it was kind of degraded, transformed by these different interventions. So in the end, he never got anything original. He only got these copies. And they say something which I think my photographs can't say. These decisions, these visual decisions people have made, these messages of support, these tokens of support have been literally borne witness to this process of degradation and abuse by being transformed themselves into something abstracted, redacted, which I find they're visually fascinating things, but they, as found objects and documents, they do something which photography can't. These kind of images, the kind of cards which people send. I wouldn't know what to send. Well, how would you choose what to send to someone you've never met in a cell in Guantanamo? They're kind of fascinating. There's a blank sheet of paper with a unique archive number. Everything was copied. Fronts of envelopes, backs of envelopes, blank sheets of paper, everything went through this process this administrative process, which had a kind of dual effect on him, because on the one hand he received an awful lot of material, which meant his guards were aware that there were people watching him, aware of his situation, but also because he received so much and because some of it was quite strange, it added to his sense of paranoia. He thought his interrogators were planting some of this stuff to actually disorientate him even more. So it had a double-edged effect on him. Things like this are quite strange. Dear Omar, thinking of you, I feel sorry for you. Love from sexy Leslie and Brian from our romantic holiday. It's kind of quite weird. Right. This is... Aha, here we go. Right, Control Order House. Now, Guantanamo is, it's exotic. It's to use a very unfortunate phrase, it's sexy. It's foreign. It's part of a big international war. Whereas this place, there's nothing sexy or exotic about this whatsoever. But this is actually the most secret place I've ever worked in. I'm not allowed to tell you where it is. I'm not allowed to tell you who lives there. But as you can see, it is a completely typical suburban semi-detached house. And it's in a very ordinary suburb of a provincial town in England. And it's a place where a man was made to live under a control order. And control orders were things which came in after the Prevention of Terrorism Act in 2005. And they were effectively, and they are effectively, a form of detention without trial in the United Kingdom. People that are held under these will not be, well, it's kind of an ongoing process of assessment, but they are not going to be given a criminal trial. So they are held under suspicion of involvement with some form of terrorist activity. And the word suspicion is the key thing, because they're not held under the evidence that is there does not prove guilt. All it has to do is to amount to a reasonable suspicion. And that evidence is not tested in court. Their lawyers don't get to see the evidence. Their lawyers don't get to contest the evidence. They don't get to know where it's come from. The evidence is secret. And that's because it either comes from sources which the Home Office doesn't wish to reveal, so foreign intelligence agencies, for example, or from sources which are inadmissible in court, so phone tapping, bugging, paid informants, or because the evidence is not strong enough. It wouldn't stand up in open court to being put through the normal process of testing, of examination in a court situation. So these people, like this man, are relocated. I mean, the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, says, I think there is reasonable suspicion that this person has been involved in some sort of terrorist activity. A judge gets to see this in closed session. He will say, yes, the Secretary of State has reasonable suspicion and is carrying out the power they have in the correct way. And this person would then be relocated to live in a house away from their home, where they live under a form of house arrest. So they are tagged, they live under a curfew, they have to report to a police station every day, they're not allowed access to the internet, they are given a phone to use. Each control order differs slightly, but this particular person was allowed to meet people in the streets. If someone went up to him and met him in the street, he could stay and talk to them, but he wasn't allowed to go to a cafe or to a restaurant with them. He wasn't allowed to meet a group of people. He could only move within a certain perimeter in the town he was in. He had to allow people to come and search his property whenever they wanted. The way in which he lived in the property, kind of normal elements of a tenancy agreement, were made part of his control order. So, you know, keeping the house clean, not making a noise, not putting nails in the wall to put up pictures were potentially ways in which he could breach his control order. And if you breach your control order, it's a criminalised, you become criminalised. If you break that condition, you can get prosecuted for that, and you can go to prison or you can get a fine. So even though you're not going to be taken to court for the suspicion of your involvement with terrorism, you know, if you break the conditions of your control order, you can go to prison that way. And having done the work in Guantanamo, which, as I say, was kind of exotic and accessible to most people, you know, this is actually just as important. This is kind of something which has overturned centuries of legal precedent, which is in this country that you don't have detention without trial. That, you know, you have protection under the law that if you are held, you will get legal process, which, you know, no longer exists. I was able to do it because this particular man did not need permission from the Home Office for me to go and see him. So once the lawyer had agreed to put me in touch with him, I was able to go and meet him and explain what I wanted to do. And once he had said, yes, that's okay, then the Home Office couldn't stop me. They couldn't legally prevent me from doing it. But what they could do was put all kinds of conditions on me and on him as well. So this is kind of the kind of documentation I have, which talks about the restrictions which are imposed on him in terms of my equipment, and on me in terms of how I let him, how I behave when I'm there. Everything which I produce, any material I produce, has to be seen by the Home Office. It's also seen by his lawyers. Anything that I produce, any material, is potentially could become evidence in his case, whether that's contesting particular conditions of his order that he lives under, or if he says anything which could amount to further suspicion that could be used by the Home Office as a way of extending his detention. So, you know, it was a very difficult situation to work in. The lawyers wouldn't let me interview him because that material would have to go to the Home Office. I had to be very careful about what we spoke about in the house because the house was clearly bugged. So it was, you know, a very kind of difficult situation to work in. I was originally given up to 6 days access. And the idea was I was going to create something for a digital installation. I wanted to use mainly film and mainly sound. I wanted to kind of follow this guy around the house, filming just next to him, not seeing him, but filming the spaces around him. So you got to see the house through his movement and through the way he used the space, and then to record the sounds of the house across kind of a 24-hour period. And to photograph as well, to come up with imagery which I could use to create interior panoramas. I measured the whole space so that I could come up with an installation which was a vehicle for the film and the sound, but which used forms of visual forms which we associate with the choices we make over where we live and how we decorate it, the forms of control we exercise over our own spaces. Eventually, I mean, I had 2 trips. I kind of actually got to, quite a lot of the time I spent talking to him. So I actually really got kind of 3 days to work before the access was cut. So I had 2 separate trips. I would stay in the house and work with him. He helped me measure the space. And all I really got to do was just to do some photographs, was to go around each room in the house, photographing everything. And I did that with a 35mm camera, just going around each room, literally kind of rotating around, just covering everything, so that I had pictures which someone could then stitch together for me. And then, as I say, access was cut. So I kind of came away with this material, and I've not really known what to do with it. And it was only about 6 weeks ago that I got the all clear from the Home Office to use the material. And that's the photographs, and I've got all the documentation as well. So his control order, the elements of the conditions that he lives under in the house, had to be cleared by his lawyers and by the Home Office and redacted, and I'm allowed to reproduce that. So when Celia and Emma approached me about the biennial, it seemed a perfect opportunity to actually do something with this material, which I was sitting on, not really knowing how to resolve what to do with it. I'll take you through some of the pictures. But I did do a few, I'd say half a dozen kind of large format pictures as well, which became part of the installation in Brighton. This is my bedroom. This is the guest room. This particular man, even though it's a 5-bedroom house, it has to be a house big enough to hold his family. So if his family want to go and live with him, they have to provide a space where they can do that. And his family did try living with him for a while, but it was very disruptive for them. So they moved back to where he came from, and they would come and visit just at the weekend. But he basically spent his time in 2 rooms. There was a kitchen and a middle living room, and he just would oscillate between those 2 rooms. So this large 3-4 bedroom house, most of it was completely unused. I took lots of details of texture, surface. I was kind of, I found the space very difficult. I found it very claustrophobic. There's order and chaos going on. And I did this kind of imagery. This is an example of kind of the 35mm work which I did. I've got some installation shots here. So some pictures from the installation at the university. One thing I'll say about this is as the exhibition came together, I realised actually rather than creating a kind of a digital installation, a digital thing, that a physical thing was actually a much more interesting way of getting this space across. And this is something I'd like to take further. I mean, we started to do it in a very basic way, using huge bits of wallpaper, using pictures that I took on the large format of the windows, just so you get a sense of place. And then using the interior pictures from, here we go. On a television, like this. And I decided to show absolutely everything that I photographed. So you see the whole of the thought process, the whole of my time in that space and how I recorded it visually. You see everything that I did, which is partly to get across that idea that this was a project which was interrupted. It wasn't resolved. So there's I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing with these pictures, but that you see me working with different lenses, you see me working with different angles, you get a sense of me exploring the space. But it's also about control. It's also about, these are pictures which are unmediated, unedited, in exactly the order they were taken. It's also about claustrophobia, because you go around the house twice. You get a sense of repetition, you get a sense of this space coming back to you again and again and again. And used in this way, it also kind of gets across the idea of surveillance as well. It reminds me of kind of CCTV camera and surveillance cameras, which in the installation I think works very well, particularly on a television. And it goes on and on and on like this for 544 pictures. I'll stop that there. The other way in which the work is about to come out is as a book, where, again, I'm using the documents. And the way that I've kind of used the letters in the Guantanamo work, I find documents fascinating, not only for what they say in terms of evidence, but just the visual form, what they communicate through how they are produced, what they look like. And the book uses all the documentation relating to him, and it uses the photographs, unedited again, reproduced here as thumbnails, with one or two just pulled out to give you more of a sense of space. And I wasn't allowed to interview him, but I did want to kind of get a sense of his own experience. So when I first went, I took a pad of lined paper and a drawing pad as well. He didn't really kind of react. I asked him to draw his response to the space and draw his feelings about the space, but he didn't really go for that at all. But he did produce a diary for 3 days, which I got clearance to reproduce exactly as is in the book, and the floor plans. So I'm building up a sense of space and a sense of the experience of living in that space. One thing I do want to touch on briefly is the cat. Because I had read his control order before I went, and part of the tenancy conditions was that you're not allowed pets. So I'm going around this house, photographing the house, and this bloody cat is everywhere. And I'm thinking, okay, so this bloke's not supposed to have a cat, and everything that I photograph has to be seen by the Home Office. This could breach his control order. This bloke could be going to prison because I'm photographing his cat. And he said, well, he told me that his lawyers knew about the cat. So I consulted the lawyers and said, listen, I've got photographs of the cat. And they said, it's okay, the Home Office know he's got a cat, don't worry. We think it's unlikely that they're going to take him to court for national security because he's got a cat. But it then left me in the situation that the original conditions that I was given by the Home Office was that not only am I not allowed to reveal where he is or who he is, but also no one who knows him or knows the house should be able to make a connection between him and the house and the control order. So I was rather hoping that the Home Office were going to censor my pictures. I was hoping that I would send them everything and they would say, you can't use that, you can use that, you can't use that. Because virtually, any photograph, apart from wallpaper or bits of carpet, anyone can really identify where the place is. And if anyone knows his cat, they can obviously identify that it belongs to him. So I then thought, are the Home Office going to take all the pictures of the cat out? Am I going to have a set of pictures curated, an exhibition curated by the Home Office, which would be fantastic. But sadly, I think they saw me coming on that one. And they didn't do that. They told me that they didn't actually have the resources to go through 544 pictures. But broadly speaking, they thought they were happy for me to release them, and that because he'd been moved, retrospectively it was unlikely that they would enforce this condition about making a connection between him or the house and the control order, but that it remained my responsibility that if anyone could make that connection through any work that I published, that I would be in contempt of the High Court and potentially go to prison. So I then thought, well, do I cut the cat out? Do I just create a series of pictures where the cat disappears? But, you know, I haven't. So, the cat stays. How are we doing for time? What time was it? Okay. That is Control Order House. I'll say the book is about to come out. It's going to come out in the next kind of 2-3 weeks. I've got a little bit of time left. I'm going to introduce this other project, which I said I'd talk about, which is an idea which is completely ongoing and has not actually come out with any form yet. But it's called, the working title is Virtue Unmanned. And it's about these. It's about another element which we see in the biennial, which is through Omar Farth's film, unmanned weapons, drones, which was never something I ever intended to get involved with. And I'm not really sure what I'm going to talk about it, so I've kind of given myself a list that reminds me. It's about Waziristan, and it's about imagery created by Waziris, like this. There you go. That is a drone over with Waziristan shot by a Waziri journalist on a very, well, a Waziri guy on a very poor quality video camera. I'm there because of a lawyer that I've worked with, a guy called Clive Stafford Smith, who did do a lot of work about Guantanamo and is now doing a lot of work about the use of drones in Waziristan and Yemen. And he was trying to get me and some other artists to respond to the use of drones. And I went out to Islamabad in Pakistan to meet people who've come down from the villages of Waziristan to talk about their experiences, to talk about what was going on. And kind of what interests me about the situation is these two narratives. You've got the Western narrative. I mean, most of what we see about drones, even Omar's film, it's shot from the Western perspective. It's hardware, it's slick, it's sophisticated, it's technology. Yet the other end of it is destruction and death. And in Waziristan, we are fed this idea that it's about targeted taking out of important Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders. And I'm sure some of those are being killed, but there's also a lot of what we call collateral damage. There's lots of villagers, there's lots of men, there's lots of women and children getting killed, which is not part of the narrative we hear. And that's one of the whole points about drones, is that it takes our experience of the battlefield away. It removes that element. It doesn't become public. And kind of two things struck me. Before I went, I was reading a lot of stuff about it, and I came across something which a British Air Chief Marshal had said. He talked about the British use of drones. He talked about the virtueless warfare, the idea of virtueless war where that the soldier has no emotional connection to the battle space. So I kind of like this idea of virtue in warfare. And that reminded me of Wilfred Owen. That reminded me of his poem Dulce Decorum Est Pro Patria Mori, which is taking that iconic idea of sacrifice. It's a sweet and honourable thing to die for one's country. He used it in an ironic way about the First World War. And then while I was in Pakistan, talking to some of these men from Waziristan, they kind of came up with exactly the same idea. They showed me pictures of their dead relatives, but what really pissed them off was the way in which they died. They said, there was no virtue in the way they died. It was a dishonourable death. The Americans didn't come and let us fight face to face. They don't give us a chance to revenge their death. So there was these two ideas from different ends of the narrative of unmanned weapons about this concept of a virtuous way to die in a war situation, which strikes me as I've never really bought into that. Anyway, so it got me thinking about ways in which you could try and recontextualise this idea of virtue in warfare, the honour of sacrifice, in relation to unmanned weaponry, in relation to what was going on in Waziristan. And it took me back to Wilfred Owen, and that took me back to the original poem, which was written by a man called Horace, who was a Roman poet, who was a soldier, who was writing at the time that Rome changed from being a republic to an empire, this particular poem is about encouraging the Roman youth to carry out their martial training to go and fight the Parthian Empire, which we now know as kind of Iran and part of Iraq. And the way in which this idea, this poem, this concept of sacrifice, particularly the phrase Dulce Decorum Est Pro Patria Mori, became such a significant part of Western civilization. You'll find it in all sorts of war memorials. I mean, that's why Wilfred Owen used it. You'll find it in the chapel at Sandhurst. You'll find it on the arch in the Memorial Amphitheatre in the Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, the military cemetery there. That's where the unknown soldiers are buried. That's where the victims of 9/11 who were never found had their funeral service. And this poem has evolved in different forms of translation. This concept has changed across time. So on another trip to Pakistan, I went up to Peshawar and worked with a Waziri poet, well, 2 or 3 Waziri poets, in fact, from the Shawal Valley, which is right on the Afghan border, and that's where a lot of the drone strikes are taking place. That's where a lot of the Taliban Al-Qaeda camps are based, the Shawal Valley, and got them to create a Pashto version of this poem. So I have the Latin, I have 2 English translations, and now I have a Pashto version of this concept of sacrifice and the honour of sacrifice in warfare. And I got them to record it. I've had it recorded in Latin, and I've had it recorded in Pashto. I'll give you a little flavour of the Pashto.
ویال تندی چې هر خطر ته مخامخ ورګريمي دا سرشتنی اتلون شکست خړلای نشي چې تل په مینا د ظالم دشمن ظلمین زغمي دغه ساخته دا ځوانون په سټکېدلای نشي د غیرت زیر یقین ترهګر کله زغملای نشي د تیرې زور ته خطر کیم تم کېدلای نشي
and so on, and a flavour of the Latin as well. This was recorded by Britain's major expert in Latin poetry.
Uitam que subdiva, et trepidis agat in rebus. Illum ex moenibus osticis, matrona bellantis tyranni prospiciens, et adulta virgo suspiret.
Sounds like it as well. So I've got these 4 versions of this poem, and then I kind of work out what I do with it visually. And there are kind of 3 strands to what I can do with it visually. I've been looking at all sorts of imagery, Waziri imagery, bits of mobile phone film I found. And kind of vernacular landscape stuff about modern Waziristan, which we don't necessarily expect to see. This has got a shocking, I'll play the soundtrack, this is shocking. And the other thing I found is this, from 1937, which is footage of the RAF, who I found out, Waziristan was kind of a separate area. It never really became part of the empire, but in 1937 there was an uprising by a guy called the Fakir of Ipi. And the RAF went and formed a base in Miramshah, which is the capital of North Waziristan, which again is where a lot of the drone strikes have been taking place. And for about a year they carried out a scorched earth policy, bombing the same villages which are now getting hit by drone strikes. And this bit of film actually shows them flying one of these sorties over Waziristan. So this is exactly the same area which is now getting the drone strikes. And what I think I might do with this is use this as an installation using 3 or 4 separate monitors where you have different voices. You have the voice of, the drone, the voice of history, and then you have the voice of modern Waziristan. So you get 3 different perspectives of the theatre where this is taking place, of the battle space, from history and from today, and from the point of view of the imagery of drones. All either shot by Waziris or, in this case, amateur footage from the past. Kind of, that's extraordinary the way it resonates with that kind of video imagery we see from drones today. And the other kind of imagery I have, going back to the work that this guy Noor has done in Waziristan, is, I'm not sure how to deal with this, but this is kind of an element which I think I need to get across. This is quite horrible. I'm going to warn you, this is some quite horrible pictures now. Of the women and the children who are being killed. I often, I don't like this kind of imagery, but this is exactly the stuff we're not seeing. This is exactly the story we're not getting to see, we're not getting reported. And these are the only pictures, this is the only guy who's got this kind of imagery from this place. So this is another element which I'm struggling with to see how it fits into my exploration of the idea of virtue in the modern battle space. There you go. Thank you.